Welcome back to the archive for round 5 of the National Open. Here I was facing Anthony Hung, and we had an English, so the first non-E4 game of the tournament. And I broke out the move C6. First time I've played this in a serious game, experimenting a little bit with playing against the English. I face it a lot locally, so I've been trying to find something that I'm happy with. A lot of times I'm getting positions where white has a bit of an edge, and I need to try and outplay my opponent, which works well if I'm higher rated, but not so well if they're higher rated. So I wanted something that I felt comfortable would equalize and give me a position that I was familiar with the plans. And they played E4, and this surprised me quite a bit. I have not played this structure before. I've seen this against E6, D5 before, against my French, but never against C6. So I go ahead and capture in the center and decide to give white the isolated pawn. They don't take right away, so they just play D4. And I play knight F6, and they end up capturing, and I capture back with the knight. So I thought my position objectively had to be fine. Maybe better than equal, because I didn't feel like I had any weaknesses. I didn't feel like white had any advantages, but they have the isolated pawn I can try and play against. So we move forward here a couple moves. We each castle, nothing too exciting yet. B6, trying to get my bishop out. My opponent plays bishop E3. And this position, relatively simple, but my opponent has actually already spent 40 minutes in the game just to reach this position. Now, I should specify that they were a bit late to the game. In fact, lots of people were late to the games every single round. We had a lot of problems with the elevators at the tournament. The hotel elevators were not all working and weren't super fast, and everyone was on a high floor. So it was a process to get to and from your rooms even if you were close. So before the round, everyone's going down around the same time, and lots of people were late every single time. So we tried to be there pretty early, and I think I was late by a couple of minutes to one of my games, maybe just a minute or two. But other than that, I think my opponent was late in 5 of the 7 rounds, at least 4 of them. Anyway, this meant that I had a substantial time advantage of almost 30 minutes at this point. And we move forward. And I make the first move I wasn't really happy with in the game. So even though my position's fine, I'm not really sure how to progress. I'm playing against the isolated pawn, so I want to trade minor pieces if possible. I want to keep the pawn blockaded, and I want to keep the heavy pieces on so that I can use them to target the isolated pawn later in the game. But I didn't see how to necessarily make any of that happen. The only minor pieces I can take right now would just let them recapture and unisolate their pawn. So I didn't feel like I really gained anything. My knight has to be better than this bishop, so even though I get the bishop pair by taking it, nothing really gained, nothing big. So I played bishop f6, trying to exert more pressure on the d4 pawn, maybe get on this diagonal a bit. After the move knight e4, I couldn't find anything better than simply going back to e7. And I'm glad I did. This is the type of position where in the past I may have been afraid to admit my mistake and try to prove that my move was good. But here I just decided that, okay, my bishop doesn't belong on f6. I want to keep this bishop because my dark squared bishop is good. So I just back it up. And they go right back. And I thought, okay, well, do I want a draw? Are they offering a repetition? At this point, I am up more than half an hour. And I have the slightly better position, I thought. But I also was slightly higher rated. So I decided I didn't want the repetition. And I'm glad I didn't take it because I end up getting a much better position than them later in the game. But it was something to consider. If I was down half an hour on the clock, maybe a more serious consideration. But I thought I could take some more small risks to advance the position without being in too much danger. So I played the move knight to a5, trying to get maybe into the c4 square. They exchanged at this point, and they played b3. So I brought my knight back, maybe looking at the b4 square. They attacked my queen, and suddenly I'm getting a little bit of kingside pressure. One set of minors has come off the board, so I feel like I've made some progress. Maybe bishop f6 will be an idea again. I'll be able to get on that diagonal, pressure d4, aim at the rook. Maybe I'll go to a3. Definitely some options. So they move queen to e2, and I decided to go bishop a3 and hit this rook. It looked a little bit awkward for them to fight over the c file, which is the only open file, with me controlling the c1 square. So they move their rook, bring the bishop back to threaten some interesting tactics over here on the king side. What I was thinking about was moving this knight, even a move like knight takes d4. I'm not sure if it works in this exact position, but moving the knight and then capturing this knight on f3 so that I can try and checkmate on the h2 square. So at this point, we're still playing against the isolated pawn. We have a little kingside pressure, and the computer says -1. I do have an edge. But when I go ahead and start throwing in moves for the computer, it doesn't really have a way to make clear progress. So an edge, yes. Something concrete or some kind of tactic, no, not at this point. Kind of shuffling around, trying to continue to poke, create another weakness perhaps. So they play h3, I go knight b4, and they retreat their knight and offer the queen trade. And there's not really a good way for me to avoid it. I actually have to be careful that my queen doesn't get trapped over here. So I come back, and they offer the queen trade this way. I thought that if I went up the board, that I had to be careful of the bishop coming back, or the knight coming back forward and hitting my queen. If I come to f5, maybe the bishop comes back to d3. I can probably exchange, but didn't look super pleasant. So they offer it, I take it, and now I was like, okay, we've got two weaknesses to play against. We are playing against the isolated pawn, and we have a better structure on the king side. So maybe that g4 pawn was going to be weak. I go ahead and blockade the knight again, and they just trade off the bishop. So now I've got the bishop pair, I've got the better structure. I thought that this should strategically be very nice for me. But converting these small advantages is not my skill set yet. I'm typically a more dynamic, unbalanced player, so these small advantages I can be impatient to convert. So they offer the rook trade. I hit the rook again. And one set of rooks have come off the board. And I try and bring my king over. And my opponent finds this really nice move, g5. I think it's really nice because I don't want to capture it because I end up with an isolated d-pawn. And it gets rid of their doubled pawn and isolates my h-pawn. So it did a good job kind of equalizing the structure on the king side. I still think my structure is better. Still think I have the advantage of the two bishops. But what I didn't do is I didn't play a4 soon enough. It was an idea that was always in my mind. Play a4, weaken their structure. It's actually a very similar idea to what we talked about in a previous game whenever I was thinking about pushing the h-pawn to double their h-pawns and go over with the rook or the bishop. So this idea of sacrificing a pawn to give your opponent double isolated pawns on the A or H file, a very useful idea. I just was never sure if it was quite enough. And I think the earlier I play a4, the better. The computer says I only have a slight edge right now, so it says it's holdable. There's never a winning advantage or anything like that. But strategically and practically, a4 is a good try, either here or in the coming moves. So I continue to bring my king up further. And we get this structure right here. And in this structure, I needed to find a way for my king to get in. And because I didn't play a4 earlier, these pawns all got locked up. And so it's hard for my king to advance and go after this pawn. In this position, I thought that I was still much better. The computer says still a slight advantage for black. Nothing big. but I need to play like f5 to keep him out of e4. And I just underestimated the knight getting the e4. In fact, I thought that I was close to winning a pawn here with the move bishop to g3. So I was imagining the bishop goes to g3, and then the knight goes somewhere, and then I play my bishop to f1, and I didn't see a good way of them dealing with that. My bishop going to f1 next. However, after knight to e4, they are hitting f6, they are hitting the bishop, and there's not a good way for me to escape. And I'm not going to have time for bishop f1 and trying to collect these pawns. So I'm back my bishop up. They push this pawn to trap my bishop. If I go to the g5 square, they're going to push f4. And if I go back, then they'll take this pawn and my h-pawn. Maybe that was the way to go. Probably not. What I did was objectively fine, but that would have been a little more dynamic. Instead, I attack the knight, and we get this position, which is a complete draw. Opposite colored bishops, easily holdable with my king position. I just have to be a little bit careful, but I've been trying to push in my opponent's time pressure. In fact, if we back up a few moves, I didn't mention it at the time, but this was the position where we had move 40, and my opponent was down under 30 seconds. And then within just a few moves, after my opponent had gotten the extra half hour, they were down under 10 minutes again. I'd already made my mistake, though, and they didn't need a lot of time to play this position, and they had plenty of time to find my mistake. So we go forward here, bishop to c1, bishop here, and in this position, I originally thought that I might be able to play e5, but I probably still run into problems after king to f5. I'm not sure if it works in this position or not. Let's see, if I go e5, yeah, e5, the king goes back actually, and if I save my bishop, they just pin the pawn, and then they're going to have two pass center pawns. So e5 didn't work in that position either. In fact, this whole idea with e5 was just not great. I thought that if I could double their pawns, my king could sit in front of it in the light square, and I would be good to go. However, when I play e5, it's just instantly losing to the move king to f5. And now I'm losing this pawn, and it's going to be easy for them to advance their pawns down the board. One thing I kept in mind, thanks to Robert Hess always reminding us to look at those corner squares, is that if I could find a way to get rid of these pawns and only leave them with an a pawn, their bishop wouldn't be able to convert that into a win. However, it didn't end up mattering at all because I couldn't get any of the pawns off the board. So I'll just scroll through this so you guys can see the nice conversion by my opponent. Not a lot of commentary other than to say that my opponent was patient. They didn't rush this position. And once they get another pawn, they're just able to create dual threats, right? Now they're threatening to promote two pawns, and that's usually the point where you can't really do anything as a defender. And in this position, I resigned because the next move is going to be the pawn comes down, and I can't stop it from getting to the queening square. Because if I retreat this way, both of these squares are covered. So, not a badly played game by my opponent at all. I had a better position for most of it, but I was never actually winning. And then when I made my mistake, they pounced on it, and they were able to convert it. So, not the most exciting game in terms of tactics or anything like that, but an interesting strategical battle where I had to play against the isolated pawn and try to make something of it, and eventually push too hard. At this point, I am now 1.5 out of 5, having a great time, as long as I wasn't playing poker and losing. I was playing chess and losing also, but enjoying time, meeting people, being with friends. The games have all been interesting, so I was looking forward to my game after this the next day, my last 2 rounds, and I was still feeling good about my chess. In this game, I made that e5 mistake, but overall, it's not like I am really beating myself. I felt like the mistakes I'm making, yes, I could play a little bit better, but I'm also doing a lot of things well that I don't always do well. So, room for improvement, but also a lot of good things to take away. Next round is probably the most interesting game of the tournament. Not lying. So stay tuned for that. It is a tactical wildfire. Just tactics everywhere. Opening, middle game, end game. So look forward to that. I'm excited to create that video next. Good luck in your games, in your studies, and I'll see you guys next time.